Hello, hello. Welcome to Wicked Words, the podcast where you get to listen to my terrible New England accent while I talk about true crime and other dark topics. My name is Brooke, and today is episode 10. This is another long one, so a warning if that's not something you're into. I also want to give a heads up that there is going to be talk about subjects like neo-Nazism and violence against LGBTQ plus community. So if this is something that you're not able to handle, please feel free to skip out on this episode. Check out some other ones. If not, check back next week. Without further ado, let's get started. Massachusetts is considered to be the most liberal state in the country, according to recent research. But that doesn't mean bigotry is not alive and well in the Bay State. In fact, the American Defamation League reports there has been a rise in hate crimes in Massachusetts as of late, resulting from the uptick in groups like the Nationalist Social Club, or NSC 131 for short. In 2019, a young man named Christopher Hood began the Massachusetts chapter of NSC 131, and he has steadily enlisted foot soldiers from local colleges and fraternities since. He has even used the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol as a recruitment opportunity. While a majority of NSC 131's activities include spreading propaganda, holding offensive banners, and destroying property with graffiti, they have been growing increasingly violent. This summer, Hood was arrested after a physical altercation at a Jamaica Plain library where a drag queen story time was being held. Members of the club tormented guests, which included families with children, by banging on the windows and screaming slurs. Hood's trial is ongoing in that matter. Jacob Robita was born in Providence, Rhode Island on June 13, 1987, to Stephanie Oliver and David Robita, who separated when Jacob was only a year old. He was described as a, quote, fat baby with chubby cheeks, end quote, leading to the nickname Jacob Bean, although David preferred to call his son Buddy. Growing up in New Bedford, Massachusetts with his mother and half-sister, he visited David on weekends in nearby Dartmouth. Jacob played Pop Warner football and Little League baseball, and while he enjoyed athletic extracurriculars, he really struggled in school. His home life started to sour after Stephanie remarried, only to be abandoned during the time she needed her husband the most. Her health was failing, and raising two children as a single mother was beginning to take its toll. In 2000, when Jacob was 13, the Department of Child and Family Services received a report alleging neglect in the household. While no action was taken, it set off a chain reaction, resulting in Jacob's participation in New Bedford's Junior Police Academy, a program designed to teach discipline to teens. Instead of subduing Jacob's behavioral issues, it worsened them, exacerbating an anarchistic mindset. This was evident when the following year he was expelled from New Bedford High School for possessing Nazi literature. Jacob enrolled in Dartmouth High School, but only lasted 3 months before dropping out, giving up on his education altogether. The internet became a source of socialization for Jacob, and at 16, he was perfecting his MySpace profile, offering a glimpse into the person Robita yearned to become, Jake Jekyll. Jake was a, quote, proud white boy, interested in death, destruction, chaos, filth, and greed, end quote. Jake was, quote, power hungry, end quote, and capable of making others think that he was a good person despite being demonic. It's not clear if this is where he met Jennifer Bailey. Bailey was born Jennifer Rena Dunlap to Brenda and Ronnie Dunlap in January of 1973 in West Virginia. She, like Robita, portrayed a different person in her profile than the woman she was in reality. Online, she was Jenny Manson, 7 years younger than Bailey. Manson was a complicated combination of opposites, introverted and sociable, childish and responsible, lovable and loathsome. After talking for some time, Jacob boarded a bus to be with Bailey and her 3 children. This relationship was said to be rocky and brief, ending with Robita's return to Massachusetts. Friends and family noticed Jacob's personality seemed to have changed during his short stay in the South. He was unhappy and withdrawn. Jacob would have been ripe for Chris Hood's plucking had the two been introduced. Luckily, this meeting would never happen. Almost 15 years before Hood's formation of the Nationalist Social Club, Jacob committed suicide. The pastel-hued walls of the Puzzles Lounge sheltered its barflies from the freezing February air. When around 11:30 p.m., a brisk breeze blasted through the open door. A younger man, wearing all black, baggy clothes, ambled over to the bar. He didn't look like the typical type to surf the gay scene, but everyone was welcome at Puzzles. He slid over his ID and a $10 bill across the worn wooden bar top. Philip Daggett, the bartender, asked the newcomer what he'd like to drink, pouring a rum and coke on ice at the man's request. "Is this the gay bar?" the stranger muttered softly. "Yep, this is a mostly male bar, but there's a more mixed place up the street called The Place," answered Philip. "No, this is the one I want," the outsider insisted. He ordered a second drink and made his way to the back of the bar, where a group of men were gathered. Robert Perry was in his 50s and had hidden his sexuality for years, sneaking off to Boston and Providence clubs where he wouldn't be recognized. But on Christmas Day of the previous year, he had come out to his friends and family, finally feeling comfortable enough to frequent local gay bars. His eyes were fixed to the TV screen, flashing Keno numbers, but he could feel the presence of someone standing behind him. Glancing back briefly, he noticed the unknown man lingering close to the popcorn machine. Bob assumed he was watching the billiards game going on and returned his attention to his lotto game. Alex Taylor and Adam Marksack, who were shooting some pool, weren't bothered by the voyeur, until suddenly he pulled out a hatchet from his sweatshirt pocket and struck Taylor in the shoulder. Alex crumpled to the floor as the man raised the hatchet again, bringing it down on Taylor's skull, causing a disturbing cracking sound. Adam instinctively reacted, swinging his pool stick across the attacker's forehead, breaking it in half. This didn't seem to faze the stranger one bit, though, as he ripped the remaining piece from Marksack's hands. Bob Perry turned to see what the commotion behind him was, when without warning, he felt the hatchet collide with his cheek. The pain was instantaneously blinding, but Bob attempted to reach for the weapon, hoping to wrestle it from the perpetrator's hands. Meanwhile, Adam charged at the assailant, knocking the mini axe from his grasp. The patrons piled on top of the attacker in an attempt to contain him until the cops could arrive. He was able to free one of his hands and produce a firearm, causing the vigilantes to retreat. Their withdrawal didn't mean the end of the unprovoked attack, though. Things were about to get worse. Louis Rosado, a 23-year-old man, exited the bathroom during the short intermission from the pandemonium and was greeted instantly by a bullet to the chest. Continuing his rampage, the gunman aimed at Perry, shooting him in the back, moving to Taylor, who was reeling on the floor from his hatchet wounds. Rosado attempted to crawl to his mother, but collapsed on the black and white checkered tile floor, turned crimson with the staining of blood. Some patrons were able to sneak outside amidst the insanity and call 911. Daggett dared to re-enter the bar when he was met at the door by the barrel of a gun. Click. The empty weapon refused to fire. The assailant pushed past Daggett and ran down North Front Street, disappearing into the darkness. Seconds later, the blaring sirens and bright flashing lights from the police cruisers swept in the street, dominating the small parking lot. Philip rushed to them, begging the officers to chase the perp who had just fled, but they opted to help the injured instead. Bob and Alex were rushed to St. Luke's Hospital, while Rosado was med-flighted to Boston in critical condition. 2 hours after the incident, with the situation somewhat under control, police began questioning witnesses. Lucky for them, one observer recognized the attacker, providing police with the name of the 18-year-old Jacob Robita. Around 1 a.m. on February 2, 2006, Robita returned to the County Street apartment where he was staying with his mother. He frantically rushed into his room, where he attempted to stop his wound from bleeding with a sock as he scribbled a note for his mother before taking off once more and his Pontiac ran down. Authorities were too late when they raided the Oliver house early that Thursday morning. While they didn't find Jake, they did gain insight into his frame of mind through his room and belongings. Anti-Semitic writings and homemade Nazi posters littered his walls. A trove of weapons was discovered, along with a, quote, makeshift coffin, end quote, and copies of the Turner diaries, as well as the Hitler file. The most startling finding, however, was the handwritten letter he had left for his mother. He apologized for all the trouble he had caused and told her that he loved her, but had to go out on his own terms. Detectives were frightened by the fact that he was referring to himself in the past tense. Friends suggested that police perform a welfare check on Jennifer Bailey, assuming that was probably where Jake was headed. The FBI were contacted and immediately alerted the police to their search for the armed and dangerous fugitive. This warning was received by a Burlington County, New Jersey hospital shortly after tending to the head wound of a nameless transient who resembled Robita. But the police were inundated with tips, missing out on the pertinent information provided. That night, Robita arrived at the Amandaville Court apartment complex where he and Jennifer once lived, but a neighbor told him that Bailey had moved out some time ago. Jake persuaded the acquaintance to drive him to Bailey's new abode, but she refused to let him in. Jen told friends that she had ended things with Jake after he moved in and seemingly transformed into someone else, someone who scared her. The news from New Bedford had made its way to West Virginia, and she was not about to allow him into her house, especially not with her youngest son present. The neighbor allowed Robita to sleep in his house overnight, supposedly unaware of Jake's outlaw status. The next morning, Robita returned to Bailey's home. It isn't certain whether she went willingly at this point or whether she was threatened, but Jennifer dropped her son off at her mother's house, explaining that she was going to celebrate her belated birthday with a friend. Hesitantly, Brenda Dunlap agreed to watch the child and said goodbye to her daughter. An ATM camera snapped a photo of Jennifer withdrawing $500, and footage from a convenience store caught the pair shopping for groceries. Later that night, they broke into Jennifer's father's house, stealing a shotgun and rifle before jumping on the highway towards Arkansas. Officer Jim's cell was retired, but for the past 3 years, he worked part-time for the Gassville Police Department in Arkansas. He was sitting in his cruiser in the parking lot of the Brass Door Restaurant and Motel, monitoring the road for signs of trouble, something that wasn't common in the small town. Yet that particular day, a green Pontiac raced past him. Sell switched on his lights and sirens as he pulled out after the speeding sedan. Approaching the driver's side door, he asked for the usual, license and registration. Distracted by the Massachusetts ID handed to him, Officer Sell didn't notice the driver had produced a handgun. A motel worker from the brass door spotted the red and blue flashing lights of Sell's cruiser. An unusual sight. He peeked through the window to see who had caught Sell's attention, when suddenly 2 shots rang out. The employee watched as the green Grand Am reversed in a rush, slamming into the cruiser before peeling out, barely missing the body of the officer he had just murdered. The motel worker phoned 911 immediately and was shocked when moments later the Pontiac returned. Throwing open his door, Jacob Robita stepped out, running over to Sell's body, retrieving his driver's license before running back to his vehicle and racing away once more. Arkansas State Police proactively blocked the highway with their vehicles and laid down spike strips. Neither effort stopped the reckless Robita, though. He crashed through the cruisers and drove bare rims for 20 miles before losing control and bouncing off parked cars, spinning the vehicle around 180 degrees. Seconds later, the couple were surrounded by Stadies. The spree was over, but Jake was not done. He leaned over and hugged Jen before pressing the barrel of his gun to the left side of her head and pulling the trigger. The sound of gunfire caused the cops to return shots, unsure of who or what Robita was aiming for. When the smoke cleared, silence suffocated the street. The police swarmed the Grand Am, finding both occupants deceased. Regardless, they were transported to the Baxter Regional Medical Center in Mountain Home, subsequently being med-flighted to Cox Health System's South Hospital in Springfield, Missouri, where they were pronounced dead officially. The death of Jacob Robita did not mean the horror he created came to an end. It simply ensured that he wouldn't be held responsible for his actions. His grandmother Jean released a statement apologizing for Jacob's massacre. Jean also apologized for the fact that they still loved him. His parents refused to address his spree publicly, retreating to their home away from the media. The nation wanted answers, but they were begging for them from grieving parents who had just lost their only son while they were attempting to process his prior actions. The LGBTQ+ community, inspired by the heroism of the puzzle's patrons, banded together and held a candlelight vigil outside the bar. Homophobia tried to conquer New Bedford that night, but the men at Puzzles refused to allow that to happen. They were not some weak target to be taken down by an angry teen with a chip on his shoulder. This specific event would strengthen the South Coast's LGBTQ+ community more than ever before, and it echoed the message that homosexuals will fight back. Getting into the less formal part of my podcast now, I was in high school when this happened, and I remember it very well. I got into fights with people about gay rights, and it doesn't feel like that long ago, but yet there was still bigotry rearing its ugly head. New Bedford was able to recover from this, and I think that this is when I started going to Pride Parade, was like right after this Puzzles attack. I felt like it was more important then to show support than ever. So I started going there, and I've gone to Pride probably every year since, whether it was in New Bedford or another city. I was lucky enough to be familiar with the LGBTQ+ community in New Bedford because my ex-mother-in-law was heavily involved, and I was granted the opportunity to meet some pretty amazing people. Unfortunately, I was never able to go to Puzzles. It rebranded shortly after this whole incident, and it was called the Rainbow's End for a while, but that didn't seem to last long either. Not sure exactly when it closed, but it's permanently closed. La Place is still open though, and I've been there probably once or twice, but I'm not really like a big bar person. The police say that they rarely ever had to go to any of these establishments though, and they wish that other places in New Bedford would follow suit. Okay, I want to get into some facts about Jacob's parents for reference. Stephanie was born to Evelyn Tomkowitz and Frank Oliver on March 23rd, 1965. She was one of 3 girls, and there isn't much known about her life, but she was raised in Dartmouth, living in New Bedford most of her adult life. She remarried after her separation from David, but that didn't really end well. It ended in divorce. She had open heart surgery, and she actually had her foot amputated right around the time that Jacob returned from West Virginia. So she was recovering from that when he went on his spree, and on top of, losing her son and her health problems and everything, it was a lot. Stephanie ended up passing away in 2020 due to the complications from her diabetes. She was survived by her daughter and 2 grandchildren. So it turns out that David Robita wasn't actually Jacob's biological father, from what I read, but he raised Jacob from birth, so as far as I'm concerned, he is Jacob's father. He was born to Jean Melanson and an Army veteran named Roland Robita. He never married after his separation from Stephanie, so he had a lot of time to spend with his son, allowing him to get really close to Jacob. In 2005, David's father passed away, and in 2014, Jean passed away. David's still alive. He lives in Acushnet, I believe. David's mother, Jean, described Jacob as sensitive and respectful. She said that he never raised his voice, and she felt that there were no warning signs preluding to the potential violence, despite the fact that he had a swastika tattooed on his hand. She said when she confronted him about this, he refused to discuss it with her, and he kind of knew that his family wasn't going to accept that side of him. Jacob felt like nobody cared, which may be why he fell for Jennifer Bailey. Stephanie had met Jen, and she did not like her. She felt like the older woman was controlling her son, supposedly refusing to allow him to call home. When Jacob came home from his breakup with Bailey, he began working for his father's construction company, but the week of his rampage, he actually called out sick the entire week. This happened on a Wednesday night. He had called out that Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, I believe. David gave him his paycheck, though, which was $350, and he used that to finance his crimes. Robita supposedly used the fake ID to order his drinks at the bar because he's under legal drinking age in Massachusetts. However, I am not entirely sure that this was true, and I'll elaborate on that in a moment. There was graffiti outside of the bar, a pitchfork, and the Star of David, and this was attributed as an anti-Semitic message left by Jacob, but it's actually gang-related, and most likely had nothing to do with the Robita. I'm assuming the police knew this, and it was something that was picked up by the news that may have been ignorantly portrayed as being propaganda, but both symbols are associated with the gang Folk Nation. And the only reason I know this is because years ago I knew members who had the Star of David and pitchfork tattoo, and I was curious why they used the Star of David for a gang. It just was very odd, so I looked it up. Jacob left the hatchet and a 10-inch machete behind, taking only the gun with him. Police were interested in knowing how Robita got the weapon, since he's not old enough to legally own a handgun in the state of Massachusetts, but I couldn't find any follow-up whether they found whether they were able to trace the origins of the guns. In my opinion, that should have absolutely been a priority. The person who sold him that should have been held responsible for this as well if they knowingly sold it to a minor. Chances are it was a stolen firearm, though, and probably bought illegally. I thought for a moment maybe he used the fake ID to buy it from like a legit seller, but again, I'm not totally sure whether there was even a fake ID. And again, I will explain that in a second. I just want to discuss Jennifer Bailey really quick. Jennifer Arena Dunlap was born on January 24th, 1973 in St. Albans, West Virginia to Brenda and Ronnie Dunlap. She was married twice before and divorced twice before she met Jacob, supposedly surviving an abusive relationship, as mentioned in her obituary. She was a stay-at-home mom who was receiving disability benefits for her bipolar disorder, and while her two oldest children lived with her father during the week, she had custody of her youngest son full-time, and she would get custody of the two oldests during the weekend. Jennifer was remembered as sweet and doting, yet depressed and death-obsessed. Okay, now let me circle back to the reason why I think there was not a fake ID. So New Bedford is a pretty sketchy place. I smoked cigarettes at a very young age, and I had no problem buying cigarettes at a store at 14 and 15 years old. So I don't think that it'd be super difficult to go to a bar without an ID, to be honest. I never tried because, like most Bristol County teenagers, I was drinking at friends' houses. The only person who mentioned the ID was the bartender, Philip Daggett, which we have no reason not to believe at first glance. But when I started looking into him, that's when I went full on rabbit hole. Initially, I found an article about Daggett. He won $1,000 on a scratch ticket, and later that same day, won $1 million on another. So I thought to myself, wow, that's amazing. Like, he went through this whole ordeal, and he was blessed with this big payout. But as it turns out, that's not true. He cashed the $1,000 ticket, but he never claimed his $1 million prize. Strange. Maybe he had a lawyer cash it for him? Nope. A reporter ended up doing a deep dive on Daggett, and turns out that his life is filled with sketchy situations like this, all starting with Daggett's appearance on an episode of Jerry Springer, where he claimed to be a man stuck in an abusive love triangle. The night of the puzzles attack, it seemed to only exacerbate this attention-seeking behavior. He put himself in front of every single camera he could, even emailing some news outlets himself to set up interviews. But at the same time, Daggett was complaining that the police were not doing anything. They weren't offering him free protection while Robita was at large. He said he didn't want to publicly criticize anyone, and then goes on to claim that the emergency responders had made homophobic comments to him. Claims that were actually found out afterwards to not have happened. There was actually an investigation into the matter. After requiring time off from his bartending position, Daggett was forced to return to work when the minuscule workers' comp payments he was receiving weren't covering any of the bills. However, Daggett said that he wasn't allowed to come back to his job. The owner, Richard Macedo, allegedly told him that his face had been all over the media and he was afraid it was going to incite another attack. Years later, Daggett's name was back on the news when he was possibly tied romantically to David Archuleta, the American Idol contestant, but this relationship didn't, it wasn't ever confirmed, and Daggett ended up going on to marry another man, changing his surname to Brunel. Brunel would become a popular name in the news as well. One day, he was traveling down a road when he came across a crashed car. He ran over to assist the passengers, who were two little girls and their aunt. Brunel pulled the little girls from the wreck, and attempted to resuscitate them without success. He would also go on to become a wedding photographer and a ghost hunter. And it was this ghost hunting adventure that actually sparked a journalistic investigation into Brunel. It turns out he never performed CPR on the children at that crash. He did pull over to the scene. He lurked for a while until reporters appeared, and then he ran over and told them about, his whole tale. His career as a wedding photographer wasn't without scandal either. Brunel was accused of scamming a bride out of her photographs, cashing her check but refusing to provide her pictures, even after a year of going back and forth with her. Without any official glimpse into his background, the town of Middleborough granted Brunel permission to stay at the town hall overnight to, quote, hunt for ghosts, end quote, in the allegedly haunted building. This is when the reporter decided to look into Brunel's past himself. The most disgusting part of the journalist's discovery, in my opinion, is the fact that Brunel photographed that crash site and ended up sending a photoshopped picture to the mother of the deceased girls, claiming to see ghosts of her daughter. Ultimately, I think Brunel claimed Robita had a fake ID in an attempt to save his ass, and this may have been the real reason why he didn't get his job back. Also, I doubt the story that Robita shot at him, because even though the different news sources describe different weapons, all of these guns hold a minimum of 11 rounds, and there were only 4 shots reported. So that doesn't really make sense. The math doesn't add up. I think Daggett was exaggerating for this, the cameras. This seems to be his MO, but that's just my speculation on the situation. Please don't sue me. I tried to find some info about the other guys involved in the attack, but it was pretty hard. They're all kind of living rather quiet lives, which totally fine, up to them. One thing that I saw, though, was about Robert Perry, and it was a quote that he gave stating that if he could, he would go back in time and just talk to Jacob and hear him out. And I think that really speaks to the kind of person that Bob was. Nothing more could be found about Alex Taylor or Louis Rosado, but they both did survive their injuries. Adam Marczak is a local tattoo artist. He was the owner of Inksane Art Studio in Wareham, but then he worked for Sinners and Saints, which is permanently closed now. I'm not sure where he is or what he's doing, but he had some really nice artwork. I actually went to high school with Morgan, Jacob's half-sister, but she was in a year or two below me, so I didn't get the chance to interact with her much. Our school was set up in a way that we just kind of always had interactions with our own classmates and not really any other grades. But the only thing I remember about her is that she had really gorgeous hair, which is funny because she ended up becoming a hairstylist, so that kind of makes sense. My heart really hurts for her, though, because she lost her brother and her mother in a very short time and at a young age, so I really hope she's doing well. My cousin was well acquainted with Jacob since they were both huge fans of Insane Clown Posse, ICP. I probably have met Jacob at some point in my life at my cousin's house and just don't remember, truthfully. And that's the saddest part, to think that the only impression that Jacob had made on so many people was one of hate. But in my opinion, that's probably the reason he did it. He probably felt invisible and unwanted and irrationally took out his anger on others in an attempt to make a lasting impression, a lasting memory. When he lived in Massachusetts, he browsed white supremacy forums online, finding a channel for his fury. And when he moved back from West Virginia, it seemed like these extremist views only intensified. It isn't sure whether Jennifer held the same beliefs, Friends and family deny it, but it seems people were in denial about Robita as well. Their MySpace pages were both full of red flags, which begs the question, is the person we portray online who we are in reality? Side note, you may hear my Frenchie snoring in the background. She's so loud. I'm so sorry. Anyway, police searched Robita's computer, including the emails exchanged between the two, and it was inconclusive. The evidence could be interpreted either way, whether Robita had abducted Jennifer or whether she went willingly. There were no signs of a break-in or a struggle at her home, but Robita could have, threatened her. He was armed, and she knew what he was capable of, so she may have went willingly just to prevent him from doing anything to her and her son. Ronnie Dunlap did not like Jacob Robita, and he felt the police had the details all wrong. He said that Jen didn't drop the kids off at her mother's house. He said that he had all 3 boys, actually, and had spoken to his daughter on Wednesday, the day before Robita's attack, and they discussed a visitation that they had scheduled for that weekend, and she seemed really excited, so it didn't make sense. She wouldn't have left her kids willingly, he said, and friends confirmed Dunlap's sentiment. Quote, "This isn't a Bonnie and Clyde episode," end quote, a longtime friend told the news. She left him a voicemail before Robita came to her house, but by the time he listened to that voicemail, Jen was already dead. Jennifer's sons believe that their mom was murdered too. I found very little information about the boys, but I wanted to share what I could find. So there was Tristan, Nicholas, and Dylan. I believe that Nicholas may have been the oldest, but I'm not totally sure. I do know that Dylan was the youngest, though, and he sadly was murdered in 2016, gunned down during an argument over a girl. He was only 20 years old. When he wasn't working at the Speedway gas station, he loved to spend time with his brothers, going to the movies and playing basketball and football. Nicholas also worked at the Speedway, but I'm not sure if it was the same one Dylan was at. Nicholas was so crushed when his brother died. He posted so many photographs of them with heart-wrenching captions about how much he missed his best friend. Nick is also a very proud dad. Besides Dylan, it was the only other thing he talked about. Unfortunately, I couldn't really find much about Tristan. I also want to talk about Officer Jim Sell, who was born to Alberta Olson and Walter Sell in Cedar Falls, Iowa, sometime in October of 1942. He graduated from West High School in Waterloo, Iowa, and received his bachelor's degree from University of Iowa. Jim was enlisted in the U.S. Navy. He met a nurse's aide named Mary Chapman, and in 1963, the two married. Jim worked for Waterloo Register Company, which, from what I could find, produced and installed HVAC air registers. But he didn't work there long. He joined the Blytheville, Arkansas Police Department around 1966. The Sells would go on to have 2 daughters and live happily in Blytheville until Jim retired 27 years later. He loved to fish and hunt and work on his motorcycle, but he grew bored and decided to join the Gassville PD part-time. He was on the force just 3 years before his deadly encounter with Robita. This crime had such a widespread effect on the nation. Insane Clown Posse was blamed immediately, along with video games and the internet. ICP's manager, Alex Abyss, released a statement in the wake of the news, stating, quote, "Today, I'd like to speak out about the incident which took place in New Bedford, Mass. First, I'd like to say that we'd like to extend our condolences to the victims and their families in this tragedy. Our prayers are with you. And with that said, I would like to address the whole issue. This guy had problems. Anyone going into a bar, swinging an axe, and shooting a gun would have to realize that they would get caught and or get killed, and that this would be the last action they took for the rest of their lives, and would clearly have to be insane or out of their minds to do this. In my opinion, the perpetrator of this crime committed these acts not because he was a juggalo, but because he was a neo-Nazi. He subscribed to an ideology of racism and bigotry, and was quite clearly, in my opinion, out of his mind. Anyone that knows anything at all about juggalos knows that in no way, shape, or form would we ever approve of this type of bullshit behavior. End quote. Sorry that was a little difficult to read, guys. While this is true, ICP was still investigated by the FBI in 2011 after an increase of juggalo-related gangs popped up across the country. So if it wasn't music, it clearly had to be video games that were the catalyst of this catastrophe. Politicians like Mayor Scott Lang and disbarred attorney Jack Thompson looked to video games like Grand Theft Auto and Call of Duty to blame. But there was no proof that Robita even owned a video game console, let alone these games, according to police. And studies show that this theory is absolute bullshit. Okay, so not ICP, not GTA. Who can you point the finger at in this tragedy? Well, the Robita family felt the internet was the root of Jake's problems. His grandmother and aunt both believed that the internet poisoned Jake's mind. While police weren't able to find any connection to specific hate groups, he was active on MySpace and a white supremacy forum called The Right Stuff. Still, there was no clear evidence that this was the motivation for his massacre. It wasn't like the incel community where they encouraged their users to commit violence against other people. Interestingly, days after the Puzzles attack, Jake Jekyll's MySpace URL redirected visitors to a profile for a 19-year-old named Jake from Allston, Massachusetts. And his About Me section was updated to read the following, quote, "While the mainstream media is busy covering this tragic yet insignificant story, important things are going on in the world. The sad irony of the supposed information age is a noticeable absence of actual news from America's most popular media outlets. House fires, cars, accidents, kidnappings, while all certainly important to the few people they immediately concern, are completely irrelevant to the human race as a whole. Yet these such stories dominate the headlines. This is said to exclude stories of celebrity lifestyles, quote, human interest, end quote, and sports, all of which have positively no value to civic life. This standard of journalistic irresponsibility works in direct contrast with democracy. As citizens of America, a nation heralded as a supposed bastion of democracy, remain the most ill-informed citizens in the developed world. For example, a majority of Americans continue to believe that Saddam Hussein is directly responsible for the 11 September attacks, but know for certain that Lindsay Lohan has struggled with an eating disorder. As such stories grip American audiences, the current administration in the White House is setting course for America, the democracy that could very well see its finish, much in the vein of Roman democracy's defeat beneath the boot of militaristic dictatorship. At this crossroad of history, We find America much more concerned with stories which will never amount as much as a sentence as in any history book. Fascism, the face of which has begun to emerge in America, thrives on ignorance of this sort, relying upon a population sedated by inconsequential matters and willingly ignorant of issues central to the survival of their community and species. Holy crap, this is difficult to read. Shame on the American media and shame on the American public. You have shunned the gift of knowledge afforded to us by thousands of years of human progress, and have chose rather the bliss of ignorance. The price could prove to be the freedom of the greatest democracy of all time." End quote. This profile didn't last long, though. It was soon replaced with another profile of a 19-year-old named Jake from a small town in Massachusetts. This seemed really suspicious. All of it. At first I thought the initial change with that long rant was done by the family, but after reading 11 September, I started to doubt myself because that's not really an American date format. So I think he may have been hacked by somebody from the forum he was on. But it's still a very odd message. The friends of the redirected profile seem to not really know the supposed Jake from Alston. Thanking him for the ad and leaving comments that kind of sound like strangers introducing themselves, rather than like actual friends. So, I don't know. And his photo, when you reverse image search it, it comes up with absolutely no zero results in Google, which I've yet to ever happen. So if this supposed Jake happens to ever like hear my podcast one day, please reach out to me, because otherwise I'm going to have this like whole conspiracy theory just bouncing in my head. After the shootout, police searched Robita's car and they found $187, the stolen guns, cans of soda, pouches of instant soup, little baggies of chips, and a loaf of bread. Jen and Jake each had lightly packed bags too, with a bottle of shampoo and gems. And this item specifically struck me as strange because, like, maybe she was complicit. It seems like such a specific item to pack, but I've never been in that situation, so I honestly couldn't tell you what I would grab. I'm also interested in what they spent their money on, because Robita had $350. Jen took out $500, but they only had $187 on them. It doesn't seem like they would have spent that much in gas, so I'm curious where the rest of that money was spent. Even groceries, that doesn't seem... that's... like, what the hell? The other curious thing that police found in the car was a prepaid phone card and a scrap of paper with a Massachusetts phone number written on it. I didn't find whether they, like, traced this number back and, discovered who it belonged to, but that's kind of sus. It indicates to me that somebody may have been helping him, or at the very least was in contact with him. Like I mentioned before, the gay community in New Bedford really blossomed after this, and in 2014, the South Coast LGBTQ+ network was created through the merging of several smaller groups. That doesn't mean that homophobia and fear doesn't still exist, though. In the wake of what happened at Puzzles, the owners of La Place hid baseball bats and pipes throughout the club to protect themselves in, the instance of a similar assault. The bar was even vandalized and set on fire, yet it still stands strong. While the New Bedford police treated the Puzzles incident as a hate crime, homophobia isn't something really taken seriously by them. evident by the fact that 2 police officers recently filed lawsuits claiming the department had allowed sexual harassment and retaliation based on sexual orientation. The cases are both still pending as far as I could find. West Virginia has had its share of similar hate crimes, including the beating death of Arthur Warren in 2000 and the Backstreet Cafe attack, which happened in the same year, perpetrated by Ronald Gay, whose motive was supposedly that he resented his surname meant gay, apparently. According to 2020 studies, around 11% of the state believes that it's okay to hold neo-Nazi beliefs. I couldn't find an estimate for Massachusetts as far as that goes, but with the rise of fringe groups like the Nationalist Social Club and crimes like the one perpetrated on the Puzzles Club, it's clear that bigotry still exists among us, and extreme events like these only embolden people with that mindset to speak a little bit louder each time. That's why it's up to the rest of us in society to speak out against it when we see it. This is something that we as massholes are really good at doing, so that's why it kind of baffled me and shocked the community so much, I think. During the St. Patrick's Day parade this year in Boston, masked NSC 131 members held a banner that read "Keep Boston Irish," and this pissed off pretty much everybody in attendance, including the Boston-based band Dropkick Murphys. The band actually ended up challenging the skinheads to a fistfight, which the members of NSC 131 declined. Christopher Hood's right-hand man, Liam McNeil, was a star athlete at Waltham High School, and he was enrolled at UMass Lowell, where he worked to recruit new members. However, recently his information was doxed with flyers posted around his city, warning residents about the part of McNeil's personality that he kind of wanted to keep secret. These nationalists claim to be so proud, yet they hide behind masks like cowards. I'm willing to bet that none of them are even sure about the heritage that they are so proud of. After researching Robita's family tree just a little bit, I was able to find that his maternal great-grandfather was a man named Jacob Tomkowicz, who was actually a Polish farmer that emigrated to Dartmouth in 1910 with his wife, Rosalie, I'm going to mess up this last name and I apologize, Zwarksan, and their 9 children. Both of these surnames are of Yiddish origin. And Yiddish, if you're unfamiliar, was a language that was used in Europe among the Ashkenazi Jews. So, as diluted as it may be, Jacob Robita was partly what he hated. And maybe this was part of the reason that he connected to these neo-Nazis, his own self-hatred. I wanted to wrap this up with a quote from Liam McNeil's father about what he thinks might have led to the extreme mindset that his son has. Quote, "The whole critical race theory that they're pushing down everyone's throat. I'm a diehard Trump supporter. That's what I am. And that's probably where it all started. We went to the Trump rally back in 2016, and I don't know if that's when he started getting on a kick," end quote. In response to Liam's desire to have a family one day, Darren McNeil retorted, quote, "Who the hell wants their kids to be subjected to transgenders, telling story times to little children? Give me a break. It's disgusting. They want to transgender, that's fine, but they shouldn't be allowed around children," end quote. In January of this year, one of the NSC 131 members, Andrew Hazelton, was arrested and convicted of possessing child sexual exploitation material. So again, the irony of these people hating what they tend to be is quite Freudian. And also, the fact that he equates drag queens with transgendered people is kind of insulting. It just shows his complete ignorance on the community itself. I want to end with my thoughts. We as parents teach our children tolerance and kindness, and we also can teach them hate. Please always choose to perpetuate love. Prejudice is not something that we're born with, it's something that we're taught. But as we get older, we're able to choose which morals guide us. And the responsibility kind of falls on all of us to spread tolerance. Alright, I've worked through the night on this episode, and I'm still struggling with my insomnia while waiting for my new medication to come in. I did start light therapy, which was recommended to me by my doctor, so let's see if that helps. If not, it's just going to exacerbate my blindness, honestly. I hope you all enjoyed this one. I really did work hard on it. It's a case that I remember affecting me, and, you know, I felt like I had to tell this story, especially because now, like, I'm still involved in the LGBTQ plus community. My own child is part of it, so it's very, it hits home. Like I always do, I want to make a suggestion to my listeners. I want you guys to kind of dig into your family tree a bit if you haven't already, and learn a bit about your roots. Knowledge is power, and knowing the stories of your ancestors and their struggles can actually inspire inspiration. Genealogy is one of my favorite hobbies. I've been able to trace my family back to the Mayflower, and I even discovered that I'm a distant cousin of both Lizzie Borden and Marilyn Monroe. I'm not sponsored by Ancestry, but it's certainly one of my go-to resources. Thank you all for listening. I was blown away by the number of views that my last episode received. So I honestly can't express to you like how elated it makes me feel that, I get to share these stories with you all and you actually enjoy them. If you haven't already, leave me case suggestions. Like, feel free to leave them in the comments section or email them to me at wickedwordsyt@gmail.com. Otherwise, do the normal thing, hit the like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Stay safe, and as always, I'll catch you on the flip side.